taking the time to join and participate in the session today. We just give it a little bit of time for final numbers to build as people dial in on now. So I'm hoping that today we'll get quite a bit of discussion going. There'll be some questions, an opportunity to network, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the panelists' view on seeing how we can use this great opportunity of this technology tsunami that is coming or already with us, and how we can use that to decarbonise parts of our transport sector. But firstly, a few introductions. Myself, I'm Phil Robson. I'm the segment manager for energy and manufacturing in Beca. So that's everything from our traditional oil and gas clients to our what we're working in bioenergy and hydrogen, and manufacturing is everything from fertilizer to chemicals and light manufacturing. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Bacon and I work in our industrial business line and do a lot of work in trying to help our clients achieve their sustainability goals, in particular work with clients on decarbonisation and trying to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. So this is a topic that I'm really passionate about.
Oh, Phil, you're on mute, Phil.
Sorry, people. Jerry.
Hi, I'm Jerry Crew, Beca, based in Auckland here. My experience has always been around infrastructure and transport sector, and primarily around policy development, investment planning, transport strategy, business case development, and transport economics. And a lot of the work I'm doing these days is around the future of transport technologies and how that will impact into our sort of planning.
Thanks, Jerry. And Tony.
Hi everyone, I'm Tony. I lead the modeling and simulation team as part of Industrial Digital. I have a background in logistics, so this topic is very close to my heart.
Thanks, Tony, and great to have you here today, the three of you. So we all know that the transition from fossil fuels has started as we aim for a net zero transport sector, and this is only going to accelerate as low carbon fuels become more available. And at the moment, although the price point on some of them is a bit challenging from an economic point of view, they're generally on a downward trend. And so, but at the moment, still more expensive than fossil fuel options. Although recent reports indicate that by 2027, this could be a crossover point for some of the low carbon fuels to replace fossil fuels in the transport sector. So at the same time, the change of pace that's happening in the technology and the development of AI, which is going to help humans process more data, find trends and opportunities, I believe is a great opportunity for in transport to look at how we could use this. How can we not only just transition to low carbon fuels, but how we use fuel, how do we reduce wasted fuel, and how do we actually go about reducing the CO2 emitted that we burn with fossil fuels whilst these other low carbon fuels are catching up? And what are the other sustainable benefits that could come with this? You know, the decarbonisation pathway will create other challenges. You know, we've got 2.7 billion litres of diesel that we use for road transport at the moment on an annual basis. And that's around 7.2 billion tonnes of CO2. And so along with that, use of the diesel comes with, for the government, duties and levies and taxes and ETS contribution. And just off that diesel alone is $770 million or thereabouts, and not road user charges. So as we move away from these fossil fuels, what does funding elements look like? If we're going to have reduced revenue and as part of this decarbonisation pathway. So I think this is quite an interesting topic. I'd just like to set a bit of context. And so Sarah, on the step change that we need to make to move to the 2050 transport sector as a carbon perspective, what are some of the benefits that we're going to see?
Yeah, so Phil, I think that's a really good point. We really need to think about the current carbon emissions that we've got associated with the transport sector, and then that step change that we really need to make. So Just for a bit of context, at the moment, transport accounts for about 36% of New Zealand's net emissions, and that's about 17 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And if we look at a breakdown of that, most of those emissions come from fossil fuel consumption associated with road vehicles, about over 90% of the emissions actually. I think the other interesting thing is that our transport emissions have increased more than any other emission source when we look at New Zealand's carbon footprint. So over the last 30 years, they've increased about 90% compared to about 24% for the other components of our gross emissions for New Zealand's carbon footprint. And so we've basically got a situation where we've got a lot of low occupancy, but also high emissions vehicle usage. And earlier this year, the Climate Change Commission released its draft advice, and they recommended that we need to cut our transport emissions by 47% compared to 2018 by 2035 to achieve our net carbon zero target by 2050. And two of the key recommendations that they included in that advice were the below. So one was around using lower carbon fuels. Currently, we've got a huge reliance on both diesel and on petrol, but they've suggested a switch to electric vehicles, hydrogen and biofuels. But I think the more important recommendation is really we need a fundamental shift around the way that people and our products move around. And further to that, there's this need for developing a national transport network to reduce the amount of travel that we're doing by car and by truck. And technology is going to be a really key component of being able to do this. So I think it's really important that technology plays a key part in that transition.
Thanks, Sarah. As we've discussed, low carbon fuels are coming, which is great. However, depending on timescale, they could be some time away before they have the ability to make a significant difference in our emissions from our transport sector. That's why I'm interested to hear how we can use technology to help us make a step change now. And so, Tony, how can we do that with what we've got, with the technology that we have now or that's coming?
Right. So to me, the decarbonization of the transport network is going to be closely linked and supported by the digitization of the supply chain. So ultimately, it comes down to options, right? Strategy is about options. What are my options at any one time? And picking the best one is optimization. And to know what your options are, you need useful information. So I'm a modeling guy, so I'm a data guy. The more useful data I have, the better I can build a model, and the more optimal the outcome. So I'm very, very excited about the potential volume of data that may soon become available to us to optimize the entire transport network through the digitization of the supply chain. So let's take a simple example, the classic half-empty truck going up North Dilemma. So most companies now are optimizing their network with varying degrees of success through the use of, say, transport management system, transport optimization software, asset management system. So these are known things. But what about this kind of optimization, but on a national level? So imagine a smart transport network where the destination and load and fuel consumption of every freight carrying vehicle on the road are known in real time. And then now imagine if we're able to run AI over the top of this huge amount of data and then come up with options to present to decision makers. And now then imagine if we put incentives in place to encourage collaboration between the companies. So what this will do essentially, we're looking at optimizing the entire transport network as a whole, reducing transport cost and fuel consumption as a whole. But I mean, it's not a new idea. It's a great idea. But how do we get there? That's always the tricky bit, isn't it? How do we get to the digitization of the supply chain? But I think the drivers that is going to push us to digitize may come sooner than you think. And that is through the event, once they figure it out, of course, because there's so many challenges, through the adoption of central bank digital currency. Now, I'm not talking about cryptocurrency here. We all saw just last week what happened to Bitcoin and how unregulated and volatile that whole ecosphere is. But central bank digital currency, sovereign digital currency, we're talking about the digital dollar, where it's backed by the full force of the sovereign issuer. And once that is in place, then we can have digital trade finance and financing. And the impact and benefit of that on the supply chain is going to be enormous. Imagine this, you don't have to borrow a huge amount of money from these big international banks to put it on deposit, to wait for the goods to clear. You don't have to spend extra money to hedge against currency fluctuations. Imagine if soon as the goods arrive in the warehouse along the whole supply chain, the digital currency is enabled to be paid immediately to your account. But to do that, we need to have the digital supply chain in place to allow this kind of digital finance to take place. And when this happens, if we don't have the infrastructure in place, it's almost like running a retail business today without the use of FPOS. So this wave of technology is coming, and whether we like it or not, and the digitization of the supply chain is going to generate this huge amount of data, which we then can use to decarbonize the transport network.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Wow, a bit of a complex subject there, but wouldn't it be great for New Zealand if we could implement half of what you've raised? And I think really important point that you raise is that the ability to be more efficient with the fuel that we use, so getting more efficient, whether that's in private vehicles or on a transport sector, about the actual number of kilometres that we drive for the benefit we create for driving those kilometres. And what would that mean as a competitive edge for New Zealand Inc.? I think that's actually quite exciting. So thanks for raising that. But Jerry, how does the future of transport technology, including AI, influence and guide decisions, as well as funding plans impacting on how we live?
Well, I think it will be immense in terms of how it impacts how we live in the future. As Tony has mentioned, the pace of technology development is getting faster than ever. The low interest rate environment will also further accelerate this as well, because the cost of lower cost of capital makes it more attractive for investors to take on more risk. So what this means for us is that there will be more options than ever. For instance, from vehicles moving to electric systems means we need to think about the charging network, including in our homes as well. New technology around connectivity and communications that enable greater collection and monitoring of carbon emissions from travel means our performance can be tracked, monitored, and managed. New technology around analytics and computation to enable solutions such as congestion pricing to intelligent transport systems means that we can actually drive more efficiencies from our network as well. In terms of materials and energy, there's also likely to be more alternative renewable energy options as well, from biofuel, hydrogen, and also more battery storage options. What may seem far-fetched, a lot of autonomous vehicle systems, for instance, including autonomous public transport vehicles, and the autonomous and the AI that goes into the systems, have been developing at such a fast pace that we can actually see this coming faster than we ever imagined. This case, these changes can mean a different way of how and where and when we recharge the vehicles, how we store the energy, and potentially even reselling the energy back to the grid. But also means that an increased security risk when we are getting more dependence on all these new technologies as well moving forward. Okay,
that's really interesting, Jerry. However, what I'm hearing is that there's going to be a lot more data out there on the web, or wherever it's going to be stored. And we all just saw what happened recently with the Waikato District Health Board. So there's some risks and challenges, but also some opportunities with that. So it's really interesting to me about how we're going to manage that security and privacy of information. And Tony, what would that look like? And sorry, just before you answer, I do apologise to the audience because I didn't make clear at the beginning that questions are starting to come through, and the intention of the panel is we will get to the questions towards the end of the session. So apologies for not pointing that out at the beginning. So Tony, some of these challenges and opportunities and risks, how are we going to deal with those?
100%. So to the biggest issue around the digitization of supply chain and CBDC, ultimately, central bank digital currency, are going to be privacy and power. It's kind of like social media today. You know, should anybody, particularly a government, have that kind of power? Optimizing transport and reducing the number of heavy vehicles and driving hours on the road will literally save lives. But how do we manage that with knowing where every vehicle is? How do we effectively anonymize the data so we still have so it's still useful, but we protect people's privacy? Things with CBDC, you know, there's major discussions currently underway about whether it should be like a distributed ledger system or a centralized control. You know, should anybody, especially governments, have that kind of power knowing where all the money went? But these are the kind of questions that we as a society need to work through. I think the genie is kind of out of the bottle now. You know, the benefit of a digitized supply chain that supports this kind of digital trade financing is going to be too great for us not to do it. But I think we're going into this one with our eyes open. So hopefully it works out.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'd just like to have a bit more of a discussion around some sustainability aspects. And, you know, there's a lot of different elements to sustainability. And, you know, when we typically talk about transport and removing CO2, it is, you know, about removing CO2. But there are other benefits. You know, if we reduce road miles from a health and safety perspective, you know, we talk about eliminate, isolate, and mitigate. So I'm wondering in my mind about what some of the other more intangible benefits from a social perspective could be as we decarbonise and if we can reduce the kilometres that we travel on the road. So Sarah, what's your opinion on these?
Yeah, Phil, I think you've really hit the nail on the head when you talk about the health and safety aspect. So, you know, as Tony mentioned before, you know, if we're looking at an integrated national transport network, ultimately we will be reducing the number of kilometres that we travel, and therefore we are going to reduce the number of crashes and serious injuries and the number of deaths on our road, which is a huge thing for New Zealand. I think this stat's quite confronting, but over the last 10 years, more than 27,000 people either lost their lives or were seriously injured on our roads in New Zealand, which is a huge number. And you know, that has a huge flow-on effect to our society. And, you know, to quantify that cost in dollars, New Zealand spends about $5 billion each year in the social costs associated with crashes on our roads. And you know, that's not just costs associated with our hospitals, but also, you know, losses in wages and grief, and there's a number of different aspects to that. So that's a huge benefit if we're looking at, you know, reducing the number of kilometers traveled. I think one of the other benefits as well is if we're, you know, reducing our fossil fuel usage and switching to sort of low carbon or zero carbon fuels, there'll be a huge impact on our air quality and pollution as well. This is a little bit more difficult to quantify, but you know, diesel and petrol exhaust results in a huge amount of pollution to our atmosphere. There's over 40 pollutants that are released during the combustion of these fossil fuels, and that has a huge impact on our health as well. So there's an estimate that around 400 Kiwis a year die from air pollution associated with vehicle exhausts. They can cause a number of different diseases like heart disease and lung cancer, can impact on asthma, and also stunt lung development as well. So there's a huge amount of benefit from transitioning away from fossil fuels in that respect. And I think quantifying that impact on the health system as well, you know, there's a cost associated with that. So that's just a couple of the benefits, but yeah, there's a number if we're looking to make these transitions.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And as you say, some confronting stats in there when you look at that, what that is. And but great to see that there's some additional health benefits when we reduce our road mileage. as well as getting more efficient in the fuel that we use. Yeah, as we all know, the cost of technology can be a bit of a barrier to entry. You can look back in time, and I sit here and I go, you know, when I started in what was Form 3 at the time, we needed to bring in FX82 calculators, and now we have schools wanting kids to bring iPads and laptops, depending on the schools that you're at when they're in college. However, not everybody can afford these. And I guess this is the big challenge when we talk about technology and some of the things that we've heard, and we've got this tsunami coming. How do we make sure we don't leave people behind? And Jerry, what's your view?
Thanks, Phil. I think this certainly will be a challenge. You know, if we look through, you know, what happened last year, we know with the COVID-19 lockdowns, where the education sectors are getting people to access, you know, the students to access the study materials online. That means that, you know, some population who do not have access to some of this technology or even digital or broadband capacities to support that, means that there's a risk that, you know, that they'll be left behind. So the cost of new technology means that, you know, these inequalities could even get larger moving forward. So in terms of that, the government certainly has a role to play in here in trying to manage this to ensure that we'll have a fair and equitable society. For example, many countries are, you know, starting to move away from internal combustion vehicles and even banning them. So if we look into this case, for instance, there's a risk that if we're not careful, New Zealand may end up being the dumping ground of internal combustion engine vehicles as others are trying to get rid of them. And the result is that these vehicles will appear even more affordable for some when compared against the more expensive electric vehicles. To address this, I think we need to think more broadly and also consider other types of non-traditional methods and models that we've been used to. For instance, the cost of new technology means that it's unlikely we can provide, you know, funding to own all of them. What this means, though, is that we could see more of access and subscription models rather than ownership models. Instead of planning around owning a vehicle, for instance, we can potentially look at working with employers to provide cheaper access to these vehicles. New technology in autonomous vehicles and the AI systems also means that it's possible that we can, you know, see those who can afford owning such vehicles also kind of letting the vehicles back to the system to play in the part in the sharing economy as well moving forward. So I think it's going to be a definite challenge, but I think, you know, it's quite exciting as a planner to actually, you know, bring to, you know, to actually resolve some of these challenges moving forward as well.
I'm just going to ask you another question, Jerry. Autonomous vehicles, and what are they going to do to transport network?
From multiple viewpoints, from a congestion viewpoint, I think, you know, it will probably say the same thing, like, you know, autonomous vehicles, you know, doing the same thing as a vehicle does on the road itself. In terms of the impact of decarbonization, yes, I think it has absolutely a role to play, you know, as a decarbonization, but it's not solely the only way to resolve decarbonization. It's around how firstly, we avoid, you know, which is around managing our sort of demand. Shifting, you know, in terms of people's behaviors, in terms of mode shift to other modes such as public transport, walking and cycling, etc., etc. And, you know, and it's in terms of electric vehicle itself, I think it has a role to play in terms of actually driving more efficiencies out in that sense, which in this case here means more efficient from environmental sustainability viewpoints and in getting, you know, the carbon sort of down in our system.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Really quite interesting. And I think, you know, autonomous vehicles, are they going to be the Ubers of the future without a driver when you book them, or would you even own a car? You know, or would you just have it as a service on demand? So yeah, really quite interesting what could happen from a individual perspective, as well as what it could mean in our wider transport sector. So really appreciate that. Look, I think we've got a bit of time left, so thanks for bearing with us, everybody. And we've got some questions. And from the audience, Tony, I think I'll pose this one to you. If you're expecting competitive carriers to collaborate on lowering the carbon cost of transport, what happens to competition in the marketplace?
I think it's about competing within a set framework, you know, and also creating win-win situations, right? I mean, it's not a zero-sum game, you know. By optimizing the entire transport network, ideally everybody wins. It's just, you know, we're still competing, but our overall carbon footprint is lower. And like I said, it's something we got to work through. These are all the levers and policies that we need to figure out once we have the power to do so. How is this all going to work out? But I think what we're trying to get to is a good place.
Okay, thanks for that. Look, as soon as you're talking, I've got another question I'll put to you. And New Zealand has a population of 5 million, located along narrow and mountainous country with few major population centres. We don't have efficient mass transport. There is a lot of talk about the need for an integrated transport system. What might this look like, and what are the critically important elements?
For me, well, a lot of it may be around understanding how all our transport modes work together. Like, how do we optimize train travel? How do we optimize coastal freight? Which, again, it comes down, what are my options at any one time? What levers do I have to pull? We can always do better with what we have. I think that's the main point. I know we have some fundamental infrastructural challenges, but I think there are still some low-hanging fruit that we can optimize right now if we all put our heads together and collaborate.
Okay, thanks for that. Sarah, interesting one here for you. Are you aware of any work currently happening in New Zealand that's tackling embodied carbon, construction, maintenance, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Phil. So when we look at New Zealand's sort of carbon footprint, we're really focusing on operational carbon, so the emissions associated with fossil fuels, whereas this question is really talking about embodied carbon. So really, when we're thinking about reducing our embodied carbon, the first option is really elimination. Like, do we actually need to build this additional infrastructure, and reducing the amount of additional body carbon that we're adding? So I think that is a huge challenge. We probably need to be, looking into material selection around the additional infrastructure that's going to be required in this transportation transition. And I know that there's a lot of work that's been going on at the moment around those different material selection, and I think that's a really important aspect that we need to think about. We are going to need additional infrastructure for this transition, but we need to be really careful around the additional body carbon that we're adding, rather than just being too narrow and only focusing on operational carbon. So I think that's really important.
Okay, I've got another one here for you as well, Sarah. We are the only country in the OECD that doesn't require some sort of regular emissions testing, NOx, CO, PM2.5, hydrocarbons. Would requiring this be the easiest way to prevent New Zealand being a dumping ground for polluting vehicles, and also improve the levels of pollution in places like the Queen Street Gully?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. The fact that vehicles do contribute so significantly to our air quality issues at the moment, and the fact that we don't have sort of regulations around that is a huge point. So I think also with the fact that we're transitioning to vehicles like electric vehicles and potentially hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as well, that will have a huge impact in terms of reducing those emissions. But it definitely is something that we need to be conscious of the fact that this is a huge contribution at the moment to our air pollution, and has a huge impact on people's health as well.
Thanks. And Jerry, a question for you. And you spoke about intelligent transport systems, and I think you also mentioned congestion charging. And so this question is around, how do we put these in place? What are the steps going to be needed to, what are the steps needed to implement these types of things when we've essentially got an embedded, already built infrastructure where you're going to want to develop these?
Thank you. From my perspective, I think we need to take a much more sort of mission-led approach in terms of planning for all this sort of technological changes and moving forward. One primary reason is that in some ways New Zealand is not a huge market, so we can't approach New Zealand as though we are a huge market. a lot of these things will happen nonetheless. So I think we need to work more strategically across the different sectors, because moving forward, it's not just solely a transport sector challenge. It's a transport sector challenge, but it has cross interfaces with the energy sector. In terms of some of the impacts around transport, you also have sort of impacts around the health. So, in terms of how we actually manage that. So I think we need, and then a lot of this, how we drive efficiencies and getting better outcomes, is also around how we do our land use planning moving forward. So I think it requires a multi-pronged, multi-sector approach to deal with that, and we need to have a very strong vision and missions to actually enable that in some ways as well. Once we got that, obviously then I think operationally it makes it much easier to work towards that more collaborative across the different sectors.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here which I'm going to combine, and I think I will answer these ones. So I've got somebody asking, what are the metrics we're using to assess alternative fuels to diesel, and is there sufficient supply, and how much energy is required to make the fuel? And then I've got another question around, does New Zealand have the energy resources available to decarbonise our transport network? And if not, how much more efficient do we need to be to get to that space? So I think when we talk about the metrics that we use, we're doing a couple of pieces of work at the moment where we're looking at what alternative and biofuel sources could be, and whether that's a liquid or a gas biofuel, and we're looking at a couple pieces of work about what hydrogen might look as well. So when we talk about metrics, it's not only the CO2 reduction, it's about the cost of creating that energy that is going to be replacing the traditional fossil fuels. And when you look at biofuels, there's always the need of where you're going to get a source of hydrogen from, as well as part of developing a biofuel. So the metrics we are using, it's about the CO2 reduction, and it's about the cost of creating that energy, as well as the carbon that's still going to be needed to create that energy. And then from a more social point of view, is this something around getting more elements out of the earth, and how do we manage our limited resources? So, and the second part of the question was, do we have enough resources available to decarbonise our network? I haven't looked at that as a total sum at the moment, but I would believe that with the amount of energy that we have, as well as what we see the opportunity to create more energy, that there will be the opportunity to become energy independent, I think is what we're trying to get to in a low carbon world. So hopefully that's answered those two questions. I've got another question here. The government's 2050 decarbonisation program is based on high levels of population growth seen in the last few years. Would carbon zero be easier to achieve if immigration and population growth were set at a reduced rate? So I'd just throw that question open to the panel and see if there's anybody on the panel that would like to express a view around that.
I'll take a stab of it. Technology is about hope, I think. Yeah, if you look at the New Zealand population growth going back all the way back to like the 30s and 40s and 50s, it's a straight line going up. It's very calibrated. Dialing things back, it's kind of like saying, you can make more money by saving, by not spending, but it's actually easier to make more money just by making more money. Technology should be a positive, forward-thinking thing where we take on the challenges come our way and we find clever solutions and we all work together as a whole to solve these problems. We're never going to solve problems by exclusions and contractions, and it's just, I don't know. I'm an optimistic person. I don't think that's the issue here. I think it's there's better ways we can solve this problem.
Thanks, Tony. And look, I see we've just gone a little bit over time, so really thanks to everybody for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I think what I'm taking away from this, we need to be more efficient, not an energy for energy replacement when we think about a decarbonisation pathway. And I think we need to have a mindset about how we're going to use technology to help us decarbonise, and what can we do now whilst we wait for these low carbon fuels to come. I think this is an exciting opportunity, and I think we've heard, you know, that there is some potential or real social benefits if we do achieve this. So a few thoughts and ideas that I have that probably need a bit of answering as well, and that is about, are we going to be riding the technology tsunami, or is it going to overtake us? I'll pose that out to the audience. And the next sort of mind and where I'm sort of thinking about is, you know, should we be allowing a free market to determine our ability to achieve the net zero goal, or should we be seeing something more from government to help us get there a lot faster? So thank you for everybody's time today. I know the team would be happy to talk direct, so I believe at the end of the session there'll be some links where you'll have our email addresses, so if you would like to pose us questions or continue the conversation, please do reach out to us. I'd also ask that at the end and when you log out that you're going to get a link to a survey, and I really appreciate you taking a few minutes of your time to complete that survey, and if you do it as you log out, it's going to be done, so that would be really great. And you're also going to get an email link to the recording of this session. So again, thank you very much for attending. Great conversation. Thank you to my panelists for your insight and thoughts. I think that's been really great. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of Techweek and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.